This is Teachers Talk Radio.
Welcome to this week's episode of the Friday Morning Break with John Gibbs, the podcast where I explore what schools are for. You can listen to this on Fridays or as a podcast on Spotify and other platforms. This week my guest is Professor Tom Dobson, the Professor of Education at York St John's University. Among many publications and research and supervision of PhD students, this week we're going to discuss his research into the role of artists and teachers and their perception of the role of teaching, as we look at his research paper on growing and fixing, comparing the creative mindsets of teachers and artist practitioners, thinking skills and creativity. A fascinating discussion. I hope you enjoy it.
This is Teachers Talk Radio. Tune in with Teachers Talk Radio.
And we're back with my guest this week. Again, it's Tom Dobson, Professor of Education at York St John University. So, Tom, thanks and welcome to the show. Welcome to Teachers Talk Radio, the Friday morning break, where I'm exploring what schools are for. So, let's hope we'll get somewhere on that.
That's fantastic. No, thanks for inviting me along. That's great.
So, as my listeners will know, what I'm doing really is, having retired from a long career in teaching, I now explore what schools are for and so on. And so I look for people who have done some interesting research, and that you come under that category, because I came across something you'd done on creativity. And the paper I read was comparing creative mindsets of teachers and artist practitioners. And I thought, I thought that sounds interesting. But when I read it, it was even more interesting, not only because of the way you'd done it, but because of some of the conclusions you arrived at. So what led you in the direction of that, and we can discuss what other research you've done as well.
Yeah, I mean, I suppose for the last 15 years, really, John, I've been interested in creativity and creativity within educational settings. Just to contextualise the recent paper that was published in Creativity and Thinking Skills 2 weeks ago, the one you're referring to, that was actually led by one of my students at the time. She was a master's student. I was her supervisor, and she was interested in creative mindsets. That's the way in which you might conceptualize creativity. So I was her supervisor. Then I've worked with her on developing the paper for publication. So that's Lucy Fleet, who's actually now doing her PGCE. So she was Lucy was previously an artist practitioner who worked in schools. She did a master's and now she's training to be a teacher. And what Lucy was really interested in was whether or not artists who work in schools, and we call those artist practitioners, conceptualized creativity differently from teachers. So it's to compare the way in which those two groups conceptualize creativity. So she did this through conducting a survey using the creative mindset scales, which have been validated and been used for a number of years now. And she gave them. She obviously administered the scales to those two participant groups, and she noticed something quite interesting about the way that teachers and artists differently conceptualize creativity.
And I think the creative mindset scale contrasts two different views of creative mindsets.
So just to give you a bit more information about the creative mindset scales, they explore whether respondents think about creativity as fixed, as something that's innate within a child, within a school context, or something that is malleable and can be nurtured and can grow. So it's kind of like the nature-nurture divide. Now, both groups, perhaps unsurprisingly, so that's teachers and artist practitioners who work in schools, both groups felt that children had growth creative mindsets. And, we weren't necessarily surprised by that finding. But the interesting thing was that teachers tended to be polarized in their views. So they believed that children, they held growth creative mindsets, and they believed that creativity could be nurtured and was malleable for children. But at the same time, they rejected a fixed creative mindset. So they rejected the idea of children having innate talents or being gifted in particular areas. So it's kind of polarized view. Artist practitioners, on the other hand, tended to feel that those two could coexist. So they weren't part of a spectrum, they weren't mutually exclusive. So artist practitioners tended to think that hold a growth creative mindset and believe that all children could be nurtured to be creative, and there was that malleability. But at the same time, coexisting with that, they also tended towards fixed creative mindset. So the belief that some children would have specific talents in certain areas, other children would have specific talents in other areas. So that was quite interesting. So the teacher's conceptualization of creativity tended to be polarized. The artist's conceptualization of creativity tended to be a bit more complex.
The conclusion, in a sense, is that the teachers can learn from the artists. This conclusion that it arrives at was not a good thing, in a sense, that something had happened in teaching, or something was happening in teaching, to the conditions and the attitudes and the kind of culture of schools, that was not conducive to a kind of creativity that the artist can see and can do. Even though there are plenty of teachers who were artists, are artists, and there are artists who are teachers, but there was a divide in the way they thought about this, and this polarized view of creativity was not good.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, or perhaps a little simplistic. I mean, I think through the interviews, something that Lucy noticed in the way that, so as well as the survey, she did some interviews with some teachers and some artists. One of the things she noticed was the teachers tended to talk about the fact that growth mindsets as a popularized sort of theoretical concept within school tended to be mandated. So therefore, teachers in schools had no choice other than to adopt a growth mindset approach. And a growth mindset approach, of course, is a great approach to adopt. But with that, didn't necessarily come a depth of understanding about what that might mean in terms of individual children and meeting their needs, and what that might mean in terms of pedagogy. Rather, it was enforced by senior leadership teams who had adopted that mantra. So it goes back to the work of Carol Dweck, who first did the research in that area, and it's been popularized and adopted by schools ever since.
Well, that also raises another thought in my mind, which is that research that can be quite complex, as you say, Carol Dweck's idea of the growth mindset, which is a very positive idea, when it filters down into the schools, becomes a very simplistic idea, in the sense that it becomes like a lot of pieces of research, an understanding of the complexity of human learning. In the school, it appears as a laminated wall poster, imploring on the students to have a growth mindset, which simply then becomes another way in which the students can fail, a kind of meta failure. So you now aren't particularly successful in this particular subject. The reason is because you have failed to adopt an understanding of your own learning through a growth mindset. That appears to me to raise the issue of how research appears in schools. When it becomes simplistic, it can do more harm than good. So how did this contrast with the way the artists viewed creativity and growth as opposed to fixed mindsets?
In terms of the survey and the interviews, there were artists practitioners from different arts backgrounds. So we're talking, creative writers, visual artists, expressive artists, people working in drama, performance, that kind of thing. Whilst holding that growth mindset, they also, perhaps through the fact that they had practiced a particular art form as part of their identity, as part of their job, as part of their employment, they recognised actually that there was something there that might be innate as well, that might be leaning towards a talent. And I think there's an implication there in terms of those different conceptualizations that actually it would be good if more artists could get into schools and work with teachers around creativity and around developing children's creativity. And the research on that, John, is quite clear that it can't be tokenistic. It can't just be an inset day. It's something that would need to happen over time. And obviously there are funding issues with that, and the arts funding is really tricky within the current context. So I think that's one thing that really came to the surface with that was the need for that dialogue between teachers and artist practitioners.
This programme has been brought to you by the Happy Confident Company. Our clinically approved, ready-to-go wellbeing and mental health programme will help your pupils thrive. In only 10 minutes a day, you'll be able to deliver social and emotional learning and wellbeing tools throughout your school. To find out more, visit us at www.happyconfident.com.
You are listening to the Friday Morning Break with John Gibbs. My guest this week, Professor Tom Dobson of York St John's University. And we are discussing research into creativity in schools. I was talking to a recent interviewee, and she's the head of drama PGCE at Sussex University, and she was talking to me about how in the day, not so long ago, before the years of austerity and cutbacks in education and so on, it would have been more common to have artists in school, artists in resident. And I remember I said, when I first started teaching, I'm going back now 30 odd years ago, and they said, well, John, have you met the school poet? And the school poet was a poet in residence in the school. And this was altogether more common than it is now. So some of the there's been to some extent a disappearance of the artist in residence from schools. I don't know, but that would seem to be, from what your research is showing, really quite a shame.
Yeah, absolutely. Because I think the danger is that, let's say, I think the growth mindset is great. Absolutely, that's the right sort of position to come from, to allow all children access to creativity. But I think there is an aspect to creativity which can be taught. So my area where I've done most of my research around creative writing, and I think what we acknowledge there is pedagogically a balance between structure and freedom, between allowing children to express themselves and draw on their own experiences and transform those in creative writing in the context that I'm talking about there, but also structure and teaching a particular craft, and obviously so in order to do both of those, I think it's really important to understand where the children are in terms of their creativity, where they are in terms of their development, in order to be able to meet their needs and provide the appropriate environment and scaffolding to move them forward. And I think the danger is, if you just hold a growth creative mindset, is that you might not be able to think about meeting the individual needs of that child.
So in that sense, a growth mindset can almost be inflexible. I remember teaching in the United States for a while. I taught in an American high school, and there was a dominant belief in the infinite possibilities of every student, which was very, very good. I mean, a very positive sense in which every student was capable of just about anything. But of course, that became rigid if you try to identify within students certain innate skills or abilities that they might possess and respond to those. And that appears to be what you're saying. An intolerance towards innate ability, because you might fear that it becomes deterministic, doesn't allow you to respond to the individual child.
I mean, something that I'm working on with a colleague from Goldsmiths University, Francis Gilbert, we're looking in particular at providing feedback on creative writing within a school context. And our basic argument is that feedback is crucial for children to develop as creative writers, but giving feedback is really skillful because it involves understanding what the child is trying to say, appreciating what the child is trying to say, valuing it, but also thinking about what the next steps might be in order to improve and redraft that writing. So it's not just a completely open approach, it is targeted and focused. And I think the way that the artist practitioners in this study, the majority of them held both growth mindsets and fixed mindsets simultaneously. So they weren't part of a spectrum, which I think for the teachers it appeared to be part of a spectrum. The more you moved away from the fixed mindsets, you move away from the fixed mindset towards growth mindset, so they become mutually exclusive. Here, with the artist practitioners, they seem to coexist, and I think that is a good thing. So yeah, teachers definitely can learn from artist practitioners. I chaired an event for a company called Government Events last year, and they had advocates from a number of primary and secondary schools in England, as well as someone from the Arts Council. And some of those schools had managed to get the funding to bring artists in residence in. Actually, we had a presentation there from an artist in residence who talked passionately about the work and the impact that it has had. So it does happen in some instances, but from what I can work out, that the funding for that is scarce. It's heavily bureaucratic, and crucially, it's not available to all.
Well, that was another point that some of my previous guests drew attention to, was, of course, funding and the context of funding in schools. Not just the long years of austerity from 2008 onwards and the restrictions on funding for schools, but also the sense in which funding for things that were considered extra, that were considered luxuries, tended to disproportionately affect those schools whose emphasis was on exam success because they felt themselves in a competitive environment, and also because that was their way of justifying bang for the buck, of spending money. Whereas there was a sort of reality gap that all schools will emphasize the creativity, and the national curriculum is very clear on the whole child and developing a broad range of skills and abilities and attitudes to life and so on. And creativity is seen as important, and yet often becomes the easiest thing to cut in terms of those extras, those visits to art galleries, those visits to museums, those insets with external speakers and so on.
I'm also working on a European project which is coming to an end now. It's funded by Erasmus, so it's coming to an end because of Brexit as well, and that's been quite interesting because it's enabled us to work with partners from Greece, Italy, Germany, Austria, and Iceland, and think about creativity in schools in those contexts. And the starting point, the reason we got funding was that recognition that actually creativity is important in terms of student engagement and preventing early school leaving. So that was, one of the key reasons for Erasmus funding this project. And we've been working with teachers in all of those countries and all of those contexts, and young people, to develop resources and activities that teachers can use to promote creativity through the creative arts. So those resources are open access, and they're available on the ArtEd website if anyone's interested. But the interesting thing was, when we were looking at the policy context in all of those countries, it was very similar insofar as creativity wasn't really valued in key policy documents like national curriculum, for example. Funding for the arts was something that, as I mentioned before, was bureaucratic and was quite scarce. The exception to that was Iceland, which you might have hazarded a guess at that, insofar as creativity is one of their pillars of education in their curriculum document, and what they really champion is the idea of arts for all, which so it's a completely different situation to a lot of other European countries.
Is there another context besides funding which shapes the way schools view the creative arts, and that is simply the utility effect, the advantages to the economy? Schools should be serving the skills that we're lacking, whether it's teaching students mathematics until they're 18, as Rishi Sunak suggested, or whether it's producing more engineers or plumbers or doctors. And we're all very laudable aims and ambitions, but they also are part of a neoliberalist view that schools are in competition with each other, as we mentioned before, but also that schools should serve those things which produce wealth and produce economic success. And we have to have a view that has some utility to it in order to value the arts. And or maybe that's also self-defeating, in that if you simply view artistic creativity as not art for art's sake, or beauty for beauty's sake, or the pursuit of truth, or anything lofty like that, but simply let's produce more artists because the music industry or the theatre industry or the artistic exports of this country or the service industries are served best by creative people, well, that may itself be sort of self-defeating or produce a particular kind of attitude to the arts. As a necessity to be productive.
Yeah, I mean, interestingly, the Organisation for Economic Development, the OECD, which looks at educational policy in 40 countries globally, they're kind of championing creativity at the moment through their Learning Compass 2030. So they've been criticised historically for having quite narrow definitions of what good education looks like, and for comparing countries on things like literacy and numeracy. I think over the past 5 or 6 years, they've been more interested in creativity, in problem solving, individual problem solving and collective problem solving. And now they're interested in agency, creative skills, and I suppose trying to bridge that gap between what happens at school, which tends to be a knowledge-driven curriculum, and the skills and attributes and competencies that children need for the workplace. Okay, so there, I take your point. So with the OECD, the driver is economic. It's part of that wider neoliberal picture. But in a way, I see that as an opportunity, because if those organisations of neoliberalism, like the OECD, are championing creativity, then it's an opportunity for policy reform, which I think is, greatly needed. It's been 10 years plus since we've had any changes to the national curriculum in England, and the national curriculum is 100% knowledge based, and it's really, really prescriptive. Creativity just doesn't appear there, and other competencies and skills that would be valued by employers from a sort of economic perspective, like being self-regulated in your learning, just don't exist either. So I think this neoliberal movement towards embracing creativity again, and I think it has been embraced before, we get these kind of cycles in policy, is something that could be harnessed and made the most of, and it could lead to more interesting pedagogical approaches taking place within the classroom, and children being able to express themselves, and then some of the other benefits of creativity that you were alluding to there, John, will come into play, because I think being creative is something that's essential to being human. I think being creative is aligned with well-being, and there's so much research that will point to that. So yeah, and again, and therefore I wouldn't see the two as mutually exclusive. I think if the driver is economics, if it is instrumental and utilitarian, as you say, then I think it doesn't mean that its implementation needs to just be about that. I know what the OECD is doing at the moment is they're looking for case studies of good practice, which promotes critical thinking amongst students, creative thinking amongst students, and the key word that they're using is agency. So yeah, I mean, the article that I've had published with Lucy. Lucy chose to think about the creative mindsets of artists, practitioners and teachers and do that comparison. But really the article is about creativity beyond just the creative arts. It's about creative thinking skills. So that would include the STEM subjects as well. And I think that there are so many different things that could be done with the STEM subjects to promote creativity as well. Interestingly, as part of research for another project, I looked at other sort of countries' policies around creativity, and Singapore utilised project-based learning. I know within England this has kind of been criticised and not received well by schools, but project-based learning has been used effectively in Singapore to promote creativity amongst children with STEM subjects, to allow children to develop their own projects, identify a problem in society, and then transform their local community in some way. So it's empowering, it's agency, it's everything the OECD are looking at. I did a bit of research which is going to be probably published next week, looking at the benefits of using project-based learning for young people. So it's a literature review. So it's looking at a range of evidence. Interestingly, most of the evidence that I found came from the US, where I think there are whole swathes of school, particularly on the East Coast and West Coast, that use project-based learning, and some which also use youth participatory action research, which is very similar to project-based learning. So both are student-driven. The students identify a problem and a project that they want to do, and both are community-facing. So both involve working in local communities to transform that community in some way. So both involve a lot of critical thinking and creative thinking, and it's real life learning as well. I think creative arts has its place. I think that kind of learning has its place.
I'm interested in that remark you made about the way in which project-based learning may not be well received. And certainly I saw in my career a move away from kind of rich tasks and integrated subjects and towards much more precisely driven, national curriculum focused, outcomes orientated sorts of learning. Are you seeing any evidence that there may be a return to more project learning, not just in places like Singapore, but in the UK?
I'm partnered with an organisation called Enactus UK. They actually funded that literature review that I've been doing into project-based learning and youth participatory action research. And they do fantastic work, co-curricular work with secondary schools in disadvantaged areas in England. And what they do is exactly that. They facilitate young people to run their own projects that really make a difference to local communities. And the skills, the competencies, the attributes that young people develop through that process are immense. And it just doesn't happen in mainstream education because of a focus on knowledge, a very narrow curriculum, and because of the testing regime that is in place. Yeah.
It's time for a fresh start to language learning. Pearson Edexcel's new student-centred French, German and Spanish 2024 GCSEs cater to the needs of all learners, regardless of their background, ability or reason for studying. Rooted in learned language knowledge, their assessments are transparent and accessible, allowing all students to showcase their language skills. Through inclusive and relatable content, the new Pearson Edexcel MFL GCSEs build a shared cultural capital that helps students develop an understanding of and appreciation for the wider world. Find out more at go.pearson.com/MFL GCSE 24.
This is Teachers Talk Radio, and this is Teachers Talk Radio News.
The BBC reports on the lack of suitable childcare for children with special educational needs and disabilities, particularly over school holidays. The report features data from the charity Quorum, which shows that only 1 in 20 councils in England say there is enough childcare for SEND children during school holidays. In some areas, including London and Yorkshire, there were no councils with sufficient childcare available. Parents of children with SEND say that in some cases, they are unable to work because of the lack of suitable childcare in holiday periods. Others express concern at the significant change in routines brought about by having to spend the whole summer at home with parents. Quorum conducted similar surveys in Scotland, where no councils reported having enough childcare for children with SEND. Similarly, in Wales, there was a lack of adequate provision, with only 5% of councils saying they had enough suitable places. In a different survey by Contact and the Disabled Children's Partnership, covering 1,800 parents of children with SEND, 9 out of 10 said they were not able to find a suitable holiday club or activity. While there is a legal duty in England for local authorities to make sure there is sufficient childcare available for parents who want to work, up to 14 years and extended to 18 years for parents of disabled children, it does not have to be paid for by the local authority. This means even where childcare can be found, the costs can be prohibitive. A spokesperson for the Department of Education said the government is investing £300 million to test new approaches to short respite breaks, and that holiday activities and its food programme help children from low-income families over the holidays. The Guardian has focused on plans to limit the number of students taking low-value degrees in England, a measure the paper says is most likely to hit working-class, Black, Asian and minority ethnic applicants. Courses that do not have a high proportion of graduates getting a professional job, going on to postgraduate study or starting a business will be capped. Vice-Chancellors say the measure could act as a red flag, putting off students who may feel the course will damage their life chances. The numbers cap is unlikely to affect the bulk of courses offered by Oxbridge or Russell Group universities. The government appears to have moved away from applying minimum entry requirements for school leavers, which had been floated as a way to control student numbers. The changes are unlikely to help improve the financial position of English universities either. They have seen tuition fees frozen at £9,250 per student since 2017. Inflation has eroded the value of fees, and many institutions say they now lose money for every UK student. Schools Week reported on the release of SATS results, focusing on the repeat problem faced by many head teachers, actually getting access to them. This was despite government promises that the previous issues had been ironed out. Multiple error messages appeared, and when many tried to access the primary assessment gateway, they got messages which included one saying that the system was currently unavailable due to planned maintenance. Last year, schools faced issues with late results, lost scripts and an unanswered helpline, but a lessons learned review in April said robust tests had made sure similar events would not happen this year. Schools Week has previously reported on technical issues which delayed marking by a week, and complaints that pay rates have gone down again. Capita has a £107 million contract to deliver the assessments in a 7-year deal which began last year. Meanwhile, other media outlets focused on the attainment results themselves, which show that it remains significantly lower than before COVID and that they've changed little since last year. The proportion of 10 and 11-year-olds meeting the government's expected standards in reading, writing and maths combined remained at 59%, the same as in 2022, down from 65% in 2019. Results in reading were down to 73% from 75% in 2022, but this year's paper triggered mass complaints from parents and teachers, saying it had left some pupils in tears. This year's cohort had the majority of Year 3 and Year 4 disrupted by the pandemic. Finally, Sky News broadcast a wide-ranging interview with Education Secretary Gillian Keegan. One of the topics covered was absent pupils, with Ms Keegan saying that absence levels were now a crisis. She went on to say that she would pick them up myself when asked the best way to tackle the issue. When questioned as to whether collecting pupils was a good use of school leaders' time, she said, "They do have a duty. We all have to play our part. Sometimes you have to go to the home." However, a spokesperson for Number 10 did not repeat Ms Keegan's comments, but did state different schools will take different approaches. Ms Keegan's comments have been met with derision from many teachers who took to social media to point out that it was just one more thing teachers and school leaders were being asked to do. This has been your Teachers Talk Radio News with Joe Fox.
This is 2 Minute Tech with Steve Woods, your tech briefing on Teachers Talk Radio.
Hello, this week I'm addressing a problem quite a few teachers have, the dreaded lock screen in the middle of a lesson. We have all experienced it when you're displaying something and the computer decides you're inactive and goes to sleep. I notice this most if you're using digital ink instead of a whiteboard. Well, I may have a way to stop this happening to you. However, it will depend on your school's network settings. You might not be allowed to change the options I'm about to discuss. A quick workaround for this is to see if your display has a freeze button. This will hold whatever's being shown until you unfreeze. Lock screen happens because your computer is trying to save power and also to keep you safe by locking after a specified time of inactivity. If you're going AFK and leaving your computer unattended, press Windows and L. This will lock your machine. Even if this next tip isn't working for you, this will. Never leave your computer unattended and logged in. Windows and L is a good habit to start. Now you can lock your machine at will. You're ready to change the settings to keep it on. We need to go to the display settings. A quick way is to right click on the desktop and select it from the menu. Now select power and sleep. As you're probably always plugged in when teaching, set the two drop down menus under the heading screen and sleep to never when plugged in. Now your screen won't switch off and the machine won't go to sleep to save power when you're plugged in. Remember, you will need to manually lock the computer if walking away. I'm Steve Woods, and that was 2 Minute Tech.
2 Minute Tech with Steve Woods, your tech briefing on Teachers Talk Radio.
You are listening to the Friday Morning Break with John Gibbs. My guest this week, Professor Tom Dobson of York St John's University. And we are discussing research into creativity in schools. Is it possible that the skills and the competencies that people who have acquired the cultural capital, acquired the confidence to engage with art creatively, at the moment, two things are mitigating against that. First of all, there's the budget cuts in schools. There's the drive in teaching to measurable outcomes and so on. Creativity being difficult to measure doesn't often appear as a measurable outcome. And the other is that much, as we were saying, much of the cultural capital confidence is acquired in schools with the time and the space and the availability of artists and art galleries and the access to art galleries. I was thinking a few years ago, I live near the town of Milton Keynes, and in Milton Keynes they opened a new art gallery, a modern art gallery, contemporary art gallery I should say, and it was in a sense a way of rebranding the town away from its image of a place with limited cultural attributes. Now it had an art gallery. In that art gallery, they after a number of years carried out some market research, as you might, and they looked at the number of people who came through the doors and the types of people who came through the doors. And the research showed a direct correlation between certain housing areas in the town and people who went to the art gallery, and certain housing areas in the town where people didn't go to the art gallery. And the observation was very straightforwardly that it was socio-economic in relationship, that poorer people tended not to go to the art gallery. They carried out some research to find out why this was. And of course, what they discovered was that people who didn't go in the art gallery thought that it wasn't for them. It wasn't for them. If they went in the art gallery, they would be out of place. They wouldn't know what to say. They wouldn't have the right language skills to deal with the art. They would feel that it wasn't produced for them.
Yeah, no, I think you're spot on with that, particularly in England. I think there are barriers that exist between communities and cultural organisations, like art galleries, theatres, um, and how do you break that down? Well, it's really difficult. Um, a project that I'm just starting to work on with colleagues at York St John is looking at trying to work with parents and their children together with creative writing again. So uh, encouraging parents to write creatively and then writing creatively with their children. And we're thinking about where to host those sessions. We acknowledge that perhaps a school environment is potentially problematic, as a lot of parents, particularly from in socially disadvantaged areas, perhaps wouldn't feel safe within that particular context. So we're looking at hosting them probably more in a community setting. But I think it's about building up a relationship with parent groups, with community groups, and working with them rather than asking them to come somewhere that is quite alien to them, like an art gallery. But it's really tricky. I think it's really important because also what the research shows, from purely from a sort of educational outcome perspective, is that where you do get parental buy-in and where schools do work closely with their parents, so they're engaged and they're involved, then outcomes for children, increase rapidly. So it's something to aspire to. But yeah, I think you're right. Between cultural organisations, schools, and particularly communities, there are these barriers that need to be understood in order to be overcome.
Well, in a sense, schools have a role to play there in enabling students to have the feeling, or enabling people, not just because I think that access to art is probably just a good thing anyway, that broad access, and we talk about broad access, you have to question those things and wonder why a broad access to art is good, but not just because a broad access to art might be in itself a good thing, but because we're in danger of creating a society which excludes and includes, and I suspect there's an underlying tendency for that to be the desired case. That in a sense, art has been perceived as being a differentiator between us and them. Just as generations of working class kids have left schools having understood by the nature of the grading system or the way in which GCSE English literature or art was taught, was that was not for them. They had in fact acquired an assessment in their own inability to engage with art, literature, creative writing, drawing, or whatever. That creativity, in a sense, one of the ways in which schools actively don't fail to teach creativity is they actively fail to de-creativity people. They create a sense in which creativity has become out of the reach of your ordinary life. So now you must be released into society, as it were, as a passive receiver of culture and not as a creator or engager with culture.
Yeah, absolutely. So I think what's happened is thinking about some of the research we've done in primary schools around creativity, and thinking in particular around writing and creative writing. If you look at the way that's assessed at the moment, it's very, very narrow, focus on technical aspects, spelling, punctuation, and grammar. And it kind of means that, in terms of the teaching, the way that is taught in schools is quite prescriptive. It's like, these are the words you need to include. I would like you to use, for example, fronted adverbials. So it's not about content, it's not about idea development. And in terms of feedback and redrafting, again, that tends to be technical. It tends to be about changing those spellings rather than thinking about, okay, actually, how might we improve this piece of writing by developing this character? How might we, show something about this character through the use of dialogue? Would it be beneficial to change the point of view we're using in this piece? So that kind of radical redrafting is precluded by the narrow curriculum and the testing regime. I'm just thinking my eldest daughter is doing her GCSEs at the moment, so that's quite interesting. I mean, the amount of knowledge that she needs to learn. Luckily, she's got really, really good memory, almost photographic memory, so she can remember this stuff. And I think about kids who can't remember, that they're at a real disadvantage. But going through the creative writing paper with her, which tends to be either an image or a statement, and then within test conditions, the children have to write a few sides of paper in response to that. It just seems a crazy way of testing creative writing. So so I think you're right. I think a lot of things would have to change as well. I think the way we assess would have to change. How do you assess creativity? Well, I think it's much more, it is quite complicated. So it's easier to measure things like spelling rather than thinking about the content of the piece of writing. But actually, but I think teachers would enjoy the professional development that would go along with that in terms of thinking about assessing the quality of, for example, creative writing.
And that raises the issue of educating the whole person, educating people for life, and giving them not only the skills that they might be able to utilise effectively in the marketplace, or might be good for our economy, but it will also be good for their own mental health, their own sense of their own identity as a person that is capable and empowered. And that, I think, is something which when we talk about creativity, and we talk about the engagement with art and what the artist can bring in the school, is almost as important, more important, if we were to redirect our attention to the notion of schools as places for educating people to be fulfilled, to have fulfilled lives and not just prosperous lives. The tendency I've observed in my career is away from things like rich tasks, away from integrated topic-based, away from integrated subjects and project work and empowerment, as seeing those kind of as not directed more efficiently enough, as time not directed efficiently enough. And so I wonder if what the prospect is of a return to, and it would be a return, I think, to that kind of approach to learning.
Yeah, absolutely. So, and I think, to look at we'll look at what underpins that in terms of neoliberalism. So it's that free market economy. In England, that was around academisation and the accountability measures with Ofsted. So once you set up that kind of system where schools are going to be measured on exam results, where schools are going to be compared, where those schools that do better are going to be given more resources to lead multi-academy trusts, to lead training in specific geographical locations, then what you are going to get is schools playing that game as best they can in order to be as successful as they can. Yeah, I think there is an impact on our children and on things like their creativity and, dare I say it, and on their well-being.
This programme has been brought to you by the Happy Confident Company. Our clinically approved, ready-to-go wellbeing and mental health programme will help your pupils thrive. In only 10 minutes a day, you'll be able to deliver social and emotional learning and wellbeing tools throughout your school. To find out more, visit us at www.happyconfident.com.
You are listening to the Friday Morning Break with John Gibbs. My guest this week, Professor Tom Dobson of York St John's University, and we are discussing research into creativity in schools.
Yeah, I think it's been going the wrong way for a number of years now, and teachers that I've spoken to, a lot of them say that they feel it's been going the wrong way as well, mainly due to academisation. So that feeling that as a teacher you have less autonomy, that lessons are mandated, and that therefore puts a squeeze on creativity. But as I alluded to earlier, I think these things come in cycles, and I think the OECD's recent emphasis on student agency and creative thinking skills will at some point lead to policy reform. I think the danger is what you also alluded to, is then that becomes another way of another thing to measure and another point of comparison between schools, who then might take quite a kind of narrow approach to what creativity is. So yeah, that is the danger. But I think that will depend on how it's articulated within those schools. I think within, we can talk neoliberalism, talk academisation. We still have within that system, we can still, and we do have fantastic schools, fantastic teachers who do provide those opportunities despite all of that for children. So I think I can't see neoliberalisation changing or academisation changing. I can see policy changing, and I can see that policy change providing greater affordances for senior leaders and teachers to provide young people with opportunities to develop their creativity.
I'm sure you're absolutely right. There's lots of teachers listening to this right now who are doing all sorts of interesting, creative, project-based things that are engaging students in work. That's the nature of the teaching profession. It will a tendency towards a desire to create fun, enjoyment, engagement. You can't teach without wanting to do that. And I guess if the neoliberalist context of marketplaces and schools in competition with each other and so on isn't going anywhere soon, at least in its own terms, it might embrace, as you say, from the OECD, it might embrace creativity, since the economy we live in is clearly a creative industries economy. So in its own terms, and if for only instrumental reasons, we might be able to convince, society might convince itself that it would be a rather good, beneficial thing for us all if students left school with the ability to engage creatively in the world in an economic sense.
Absolutely. And I think we started this interview with me describing how within this piece of research, teachers tend to believe that having a fixed mindset and a growth mindset were mutually exclusive. And I don't think they are. And that's what artistic practitioners sort of show through their experience. I don't think, creativity for personal development need be mutually exclusive for creativity for economic gain. Both can run together in tandem, as it were. And also I think that Ofsted are highly criticised recently in this country as a way of holding schools to account. An interesting aspect of their inspection regime, of course, is personal development, which is one of the key areas. And that emphasis in terms of what constitutes a good school in England, and it's not just around attainment, but around the personal development of all the children within that school, is key, and is quite a progressive move within a wider neoliberal context.
Yeah, that is encouraging, and in line really with what we were saying earlier about how within the context of the current times, it's still an education profession, and people will still want to be, Ofsted inspectors included, and the whole machinery of school inspection will want to have very noble aims, in a sense that education is a very noble aiming sort of enterprise. I'm a bit worried when I think about schools, though, is the kind of the display board effect, the glossy display board, which is covered in positive messages and maps and information to inspire students, which students rarely look at. In fact, it's for the parents to observe on parents' evening, or visitors to the school to conclude that the place must be a vibrant and creative place. The presentation of "we are a creative place" may be offset by the context of all the things we said that tend to mitigate against genuine personal autonomy, creativity, independence, and opportunity to be creative. We'd use the term creativity a lot, and because all of us would agree, it's like, we hope students can be creative, want them to be creative as a creative school, creative classroom, all those things. Is there any real agreement as to what we mean by the term creativity?
I mean, I quite like Anna Craft's definition of creativity. So she talks about small c creativity and big C creativity. And big C creativity is, where you make a contribution to society that might change the way people think about something, or where you bring out a new novel which is not derivative but wholly seminal, like James Joyce with Ulysses. So that kind of thing. And then small c creativity is where you do something that is original and new for you, in relation to what you have done before. So where you begin to see things differently, where you begin to, I quite like the concept of defamiliarization. So this is the ability to see things differently. And I think there was a Russian scholar in the 1930s who said that was actually the purpose of the arts, to enable people to see things differently. But I suppose small c creativity for me would be an individual receiving that kind of pleasure that you get from making a new discovery, from seeing something differently, and the pleasure that you get from that, I think, is what gives you that feeling of well-being. So ever since I've been in my early 20s, I've as a hobby, I've been writing creatively. I've been lucky enough to do some of that within my job as well. But that process of creative writing, of discovering things about writing and about myself through that creative process, is something which has just made me feel better about myself, and giving me better mental health and well-being, I would argue. So yeah, I think it's a very personal thing.
Yes, I think creativity can be a very individual thing. It feels very individual. It feels like it's something of inspiration. We use terms like inspiration or touched by a muse, and ideas do appear to sort of appear, as it were, almost miraculously in our minds as we stare at a blank page and where did that brilliant idea come from? But I think also society, culturally, we like the idea of the artist in the garret, the individual labouring away on their own, or the lone genius. Whereas a lot of creativity, indeed, the creativity of artistic or scientific exploration, is often built on the shoulders of thousands of other people making small incremental improvements. And creativity is largely necessarily highly organic and involved in a wide range of teamwork. So I wonder if you've explored this idea of how schools can encourage a kind of more organic, creative form of creativity.
No, and I think, that kind of collective creativity is really important. I mean, something that I have been interested in recently as well is the idea of co-creation. So at Leeds Beckett University, worked with colleagues, including Dr. Lisa Stevenson, on some co-creation projects where we wrote novels with children who were underrepresented in children's literature. And so I think co-creation actually is something, it's kind of flavour of the month at the moment with funders and with arts organisations, but it's something we could be seeing more of in schools. And in terms of future projects, you mentioned you're going to ask me earlier. The one that we're looking at is a co-creation project with parents and their children, looking at what can be gained from parents and children writing together. We're at quite early stages with this one. We got some experts together at York St John last Friday, so people from sort of with mental health expertise, people who work for the NHS, people who worked in schools, people who were artists. So it's kind of transdisciplinary. But I suppose one of the things we might be looking at is whether children and parents writing creatively together not only might improve creative writing from a sort of school perspective, but might also develop mutuality, improve relationships. One idea was that perhaps we looked at how it might improve attachment, in relation to Bowlby's attachment theory. So that's a project that's in early stages with Professor Abby Curtis, who's Professor of Creative Writing at York St John, and Dr. Paige Davis, who's a psychology background, and Jane Collins and Paul Eckert. So there's 5 of us in that project. So I'm looking forward to how that's developing. Other projects I'm involved with, I'm going to continue working with Enactus UK and their Next Gen Leaders programme to try and capture in research some of what they do in secondary schools using project-based learning and participatory action research, and try and capture it in a way that's participatory as well, so it involves the young people in that research programme. The other project that I've got is maybe slightly tangential in terms of your audience, John, but a lot of we've got a course which is a professional doctorate in education, which I lead at York St John, and a lot of teachers do that course, teachers who are interested in investigating their own practice as teachers and are interested in doing research into their own practice. They're normally doing it because they want to improve outcomes for students, or improve the way in which their students participate in their lessons, maybe around well-being. So it's a really great course to be leading, and what I'm particularly interested in is when the EdD students come to write up their thesis, they tend to follow a traditional academic approach. It's like there's a bit of a writing frame about how you should do your academic thesis. And I'm quite interested in affording those teachers who are writing the theses a bit more freedom to be creative in the way that they write that. So it comes back to creativity again, because I kind of feel that, particularly because what's being researched is live practice, so it's teachers reflecting upon capturing what actually happens in their classroom, then to write it in a traditional academic way, which is very, very linear, very impersonal, is not actually that appropriate. It doesn't accurately represent the lived experience of the teachers themselves and the children within the classroom. I'm also interested in promoting participatory approaches where the teachers aren't doing research to the children in the class, where the teachers are part of that research process, and then thinking about what that might look like in terms of the way that the research is represented and written up. So that's the kind of third area that I'm working on at the moment. Yeah.
One of my recent guests was Dr. Jennifer Chung, who teaches at University College London and has written a fascinating book studying the Finnish education system. She herself taught in Finland for a while. And of course, Finland is famous for having this extremely well thought of education system with the outcomes that are measured as being very successful on the PISA scores. One of the observations she made was that the connection between academic research into teaching and teaching itself were much narrower in Finland, as every teacher was encouraged to conduct during their teaching career some kind of academic research, and indeed links between universities and schools were much closer. And so one of the things I've been lucky enough to do in this program and this podcast is to talk to academics. And of course, there's a lot, as you're proving today, an awful lot of fascinating research going into what successful teaching looks like, what learning looks like, the connections between the brain and learning and so on. And yet, does that percolate down into the classroom? And making a connection between the researcher, the PhD student, and actual practice must be quite challenging.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think so one of the problems you've got with doing a doctorate is that the writing that comes out of it, particularly if it's very traditional, is quite esoteric, academic, it's impenetrable. A copy of it will go to the British Library, no one will ever read it. So I think one of the things that we're thinking about is a bit more freedom in terms of the format of how it's written. A big focus on audience. Who are you actually writing that for? Now, obviously, you have to be writing, if you're doing a doctorate, you have to be writing for the examiners. You have to be meeting the learning outcomes that are stipulated by the university. But our argument is that you should also be writing for key stakeholders. So that might be teachers within the school, might be senior leadership, it might be policy makers who can pick that up, understand what's going on there, and make sense of it. You could also argue, and I would argue, that if your thesis is about children, you should also be writing about children. So that might be that. So it might be that there's a section of it or a reiteration of part of it that is aimed at that particular audience. And I think that's been the problem traditionally in academia, is that it's, I mean, just what you're saying about art galleries before, you know, there are these barriers that are put up, and it can become quite esoteric. So yeah, that's something we're looking at, and encouraging students on our EdD program to think about who is the audience and what kind of language is appropriate, therefore.
Well, that, Tom, brings us to an end. The hour has flown by, and thank you so much for giving me and the listeners to this podcast an insight into the kind of research that's going on at St John's, York University, and across the country in the university departments of education, where research of a fascinating kind is being carried out. So thank you so much for this insight into that world, into the world of research. And those listeners who want to find out more about Tom's work and research papers can find that on the website of the university or in other academic journals. And there's a few links here on the podcast. So Tom, thank you so much for joining me.
No, it's great, John. I've really enjoyed talking to you. It's been a very varied discussion there, and some great questions. So thank you very much.
And that brings to an end this episode of the Friday Morning Break with John Gibbs. I hope you've enjoyed my discussion with Professor Tom Dobson of York St John's University, as we explored not only the nature of creativity and what teachers can learn from artists and possibly vice versa, but also the way in which higher education is exploring issues of creativity and of bridging the gap between research and schools. It was, as Tom pointed out, a wide-ranging discussion, and if you want to listen to it again, or you want to listen to parts of it again, you can find it on Spotify and multiple other platforms. Thank you so much for listening.
It's time for a fresh start to language learning. Pearson Edexcel's new student-centred French, German and Spanish 2024 GCSEs cater to the needs of all learners, regardless of their background, ability or reason for studying. Rooted in learned language knowledge, their assessments are transparent and accessible, allowing all students to showcase their language skills. Through inclusive and relatable content, the new Pearson Edexcel MFL GCSEs build a shared cultural capital that helps students develop an understanding of and appreciation for the wider world. Find out more at go.pearson.com/MFL GCSE 24.
You've been listening to Teachers Talk Radio. Tune in live and listen back at ttradio.org. We look forward to hearing from you next time on Teachers Talk Radio.